Warning.
Warning. This podcast contains adult themes, profanity, speculative science, and wildly inappropriate theories about the end of humanity. If you're sensitive to topics like infectious disease, drug use, apocalypse jokes, or talking about zombies like they're real, you might want to keep walking. We're not here to comfort you. We're here to freak you out. In a good way. Probably. Out here in the hollow, where the crows don't sing and the moon don't rise quite right, some folks start to change. Skin turns gray, eyes go glassy, and that old hunger starts scratching at the back of your mind. If you found yourself staring too long at your neighbor's head, if your limbs creak and your heart's gone still, you might not be sick. You might be undead. Call 1-800-UNDEAD for advice passed down from the mossy crypt on how to keep your bones from falling off and your secrets from spilling. Death ain't the end in these parts. It's just the start of something old and hungry.
Didn't even deal.
Welcome to Mutant Hollow, a strange and spooky place where we explore the dark crossroads of science and myth. Here we dive deep into the world of cryptomicrobiology, the study of real infectious agents, bizarre mutations, and how they might lead to the stuff of nightmares, zombies, cryptids, and apocalyptic outbreak.
We take what's known in science, like fungi, viruses, and prions, and connect it to what's unknown, unraveling how a zombie apocalypse could unfold and how it might already be starting. From infection to mutation to transformation, we'll walk you through the terrifyingly real steps it would take to become a zombie yourself.
So buckle up, put your mask on, and listen closely, because the stories you've seen in movies might not be fiction after all. Welcome to Mutant Hollow, where we help you not become The Walking Dead. I'm Amber, microbiologist, spooky science fan, and your favorite guide to the weird, wild, and possibly undead corners of biology.
And I'm Stacy, the creature doctor. I deal in facts, but don't worry, I still enjoy a good zombie movie and a moldy mystery.
Ew. Today we're diving into the terrifyingly real world of Cordyceps, the infamous fungus that hijacks insects and inspired the hit game and show The Last of Us. But today we're asking, could something like this ever really happen to us?
Let's find out. There's over 400 species of Cordyceps right now, and most of them are host-specific to a typical class or even a particular species of insect, but some of them can already infect other fungal organisms, which is frightening because an insect's cellular structure is very different than a mammal's, but a fungal structure, their enzymes, their proteins expressed, their genetic material is much more similar to a mammal or a human. So it makes that jump maybe even more frightening if we know that they can already do it into other funguses. Particularly, there's some cordyceps that will affect truffle species, of all things. And we eat truffles. So there's another link to an agricultural origin, like in The Last of Us, which was agricultural in origin for the zombie apocalypse. It's amazing that we're still alive.
It is amazing, but I don't remember the origin of The Last of Us. Can you tell us what happened with the backstory on that?
It was from infected flower from South America. So it's our pesticide theory, or our presumed food source theory. So let's make up a story. Shall we make up a story? I like
Please do.
Stories. All right. So there's a group of scientists in a lab that decide that they're going to tackle controlling locusts without chemical pesticides. And they decide that Cordyceps is a safe and easy alternative that they can manipulate in the lab to only affect the pest species of locusts in a particular grain agricultural system. So they do this and it works great. They're using it for locusts. All of the humans that are directly involved with that grain agricultural system, they're going to work every day. They're using machinery like combines to collect the grain, aerosolizing the fungal spores. They're out in the fields walking around. So one sad human is doing their daily chores in the field. They're working. They inhale some of this abnormal, genetically engineered, targeted cordyceps fungal spores, but something went wrong in that, whether it was gene transfer, natural mutation, and oopsie in the lab, something went wrong. They inhale the spore is like, hey, I'm not too hot, this feels great, I'm gonna just go ahead and grow my mycelium in this human. And the human doesn't look sick, they don't feel sick because they don't have a fever. Fever isn't triggered with cordyceps. They just go about their day. A week later, they start to feel a little down, a little flu-like. A week after that, their partner might notice some behavior changes. Maybe they have a little bit of a shorter fuse than they used to. They're kind of bitchy. A week after that, they're real sick. They go to the hospital. They slip into a coma. Nobody can figure out why. 3 days later, they wake up. Everybody's really excited. They get discharged from the hospital. They're on the train home. They start to feel something weird on the side of their cheek. They have a growth. Now, they're not coughing, they're not sneezing, they don't look flushed, so they don't trigger other people around them to notice that they have an illness. The little growth pops, and suddenly there's spores everywhere. In the commuter train, everybody is infected, and it spreads like wildfire.
Yes.
We all die.
So,
end of the world.
They all die. End of the world. So what I love about this, there are a few things. So you talked about a few components that are a recipe to a pandemic, and transmission is one of them. So transmission is the fruiting bodies popping up on the cheek and providing a way to get the fruiting bodies to be exposed to the air. And then one wonderful thing about cordyceps and fungal species are spores. They produce spores. And what is the purpose of the spores?
The spore is like a combination semen and egg. So it's a tiny baby mycelium. So it's all of the genetic material required to put that mycelium in a different place from where the parent mycelium came from.
Excellent. So that's their way of reproduction, and then it's aerosoled. So anything that aerosolizes is dangerous because it spreads very quickly and easily. If you ever have any kind of infection or organism, the thing that we always worry about, like, for example, with bird flu right now, they were talking about transmission. If you touch a bird that's dead, you can get it that way. If you lick a bird that's dead. But the thing that we worry about is if it's going through the air and if it's aerosol transmission, like if you go into a barn with a bunch of infected chickens, if it's not infectious via the aerosol route, then you can wear gloves and wash your hands and stuff like that, and you don't have to worry so much. As soon as something becomes aerosolized or can transmit via the aerosol route, that's when we're in danger, because you can cough and you can sneeze, or you can breathe or talk or sing, and you're letting those particles out into the air. Somebody next to you can breathe them in. Some of the organisms last a long time in the environment, and some don't. So if it makes a mutation where it can live out in the air without a human host or a cell or a mammalian or insect body to keep it alive and sustained, the longer it lives in the environment, the more danger we have because it's floating through the air. And the wonderful thing about fungus and fungal species are sporulation is a perfect aerosol transmission of this organism from one person to another or onto a surface where somebody else can pick it up and encounter it. So from the time that patient 0, which is the first person that was infected with the mutation or mutated organism, from the time that that person was in the field, gathering the wheat or whatever crop it was, agricultural field that was treated with cordyceps for pesticide control, from that moment to the time that they went home to their family and then started feeling symptoms and sick and went to the hospital and then went onto the train after they were feeling better and their fungus on their face sporulated and released and aerosolized, they probably encountered a good number of people. And the number of spores that came out of that fruiting body on their face, I'm assuming could be in the hundreds, thousands or more, right? Like, do you have any idea how many infectious spores could be produced.
I mean, many, many thousands. Don't you love the word sporulate?
It's so cute,
the
right?
Combination of words, fruiting bodies. I wish that our reproductive organs were called our fruiting bodies.
Isn't that so cute? And every time I hear fruiting body, I picture the ant on the stalk of the grass or the plant that's like got a cute little mushroom stalk sticking out of it with the little mushroom top, and it looks like it's in a fairy garden covered in tiny little mushrooms, but really it's just infected.
Fairy garden ever. I love it.
Yeah. And in reality, it's just being modified, and its brain was hijacked by a fungus.
Yeah, and I totally forgot what your question was, because now I'm in fairy garden hell.
I mean, hell is a relative term, because I think it would be pretty interesting, but...
That's very true. That's very true. Really
I'm not sure what my question was either.
Oh, the number of spores. Yeah, so there's millions. When you were a kid, or even now, did you ever find the little puffball mushrooms in the woods, and it was a big game to smush them, and all of that kind of smoke comes out of them? That's a cloud of spores. And by the way, if you're gonna do that, don't breathe it in, because you don't want those puffball spores in your lungs. And in fact, just let it do its thing. Like, leave it alone. Don't smush it. Let it be a fruiting body. But that's how many microscopic spores. So if you can imagine that puffball smoke cloud, I mean, how many spores are in there? Uncounted.
So if you have a microscopic thing and there's so many of them that you could see a giant cloud of them, then it's probably a lot.
A lot. Yeah.
So when we're talking about aerosolization and transmission, if that guy has a fruiting body on his face and it pops in a subway and millions of spores come out and it goes through the air ventilation system and then it gets blown with the natural flow of the wind from the subway and everything else, thousands and thousands of people will be exposed, or hundreds of people at first, and then they go home and they touch everything, and they touch their skin that's covered in spores onto their countertop, into their children's face, or whatever it is. And then one person at a time will become infected. And this will happen so quickly that doctors and medical staff won't know what's happening. And by the time they identify the source of the infection and start working on some sort of treatment or resolution, it could have infected half of the world by then. Some of these already, but the ones that we didn't cover between transmission, infectivity, severity, lethality, and mutation. Cordyceps doesn't mutate very quickly, right? I think flu would be the king of mutation. Where would you put Cordyceps on a scale, or any other fungal species on a scale from 1 to 10 of mutation ability? It's pretty slow, right?
Yeah, quite slow. So, well, I mean, I don't know. We don't know a whole lot. So maybe quite slow. But I'm sure we're learning more. I would say if 1 is molasses and 10 is a Japanese bullet train, I would say Cordyceps is probably, I would say 2.
On the mutation scale?
Yeah, on the speed of mutation scale. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. But I feel like it has so much potential in the other areas, like transmission, infectivity, and some other things. If it mutated, and if it adapts to global climate change and things like that, then once it adapts to human body temperature a little bit better, the transmission and infectivity, it's already got it down, because aerosol transmission is king. So the sporulation, it's got that. With infectivity, I don't know.
I guess with transmission, I think that it has a much higher score. If 1 being never ever going to get transmitted, and 10 being if you touch it, you're going to die. If you are an ant, so if we're taking Cordyceps right now and we're thinking about ants, and you get a spore on you, there's probably a 70% chance that spore is going to be able to burrow through your exoskeleton and access what it needs inside of your body to go about the rest of its lifestyle. So I would say that it's transmission and infectivity, if you are an invertebrate, is probably a 6 or a 7.
And all it needs to do is to adapt to humans and cross the blood-brain barrier. Boom.
Only
yeah,
that.
How long would that take? Like, it would only take a few thousand years, right?
I don't know. I think we're heavy into speculation. I think that it's going to be if it were to happen, millions of years.
Millions?
Hundreds of thousands of years.
Lord.
It's not going to be within our lifetime, sadly.
Okay, so what's your doctor's prognosis? Like, what are the chances? Like the percentage? What's the percent chance?
Like the percent chance of zombification?
Yeah, so I've heard you say something along the lines of, as a doctor, if I have a prognosis of this percent, it's going to be this category. How would you rate it if we're talking about zombification?
So prognosis ranges from grave, poor, all the way up to excellent, right? So your expected survival from an illness or your expected lifespan. Excellent means you're going to be fine if we treat you and you're going to live forever. And grave means you're about to die and we're watching it happen. I would say that if grave in this situation is whether or not cordyceps would never ever be able to cause the zombie apocalypse, is grave prognosis. And excellent means that it's already happening and we're naive and we don't understand that we're about to have a global zombie apocalypse and we'll be in The Last of Us. I would say for cordyceps that we're probably at a 3 or a poor prognosis.
Let me ask you about severity and lethality. So we're talking about the mildness of the symptoms and its ability to kill. So what's very exciting and interesting about a zombie virus or a bacteria, fungus, a zombie organism, or a zombie infection. Here's what I like is it's not killing you. It's killing part of your brain. It's killing, what is the frontal lobe and other things that allow for speech and cognitive thought and things like that. Zombies aren't thinkers, but they're still alive enough to transmit and infect, right? So this is exactly what the organism wants. It wants to kill your brain enough to control you, but not kill your brain enough that you can't get up and walk around and find somebody to bite and infect somebody else. And that also brings us to finding a food source, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's do some zombie physiology 101 really quick. So what makes a zombie? What we're talking about when we're talking about an organism that can create a zombie for people who, I guess there isn't physiology in the movies where they tell you, this is what its brain is doing and this is what its cardiovascular system looks like, right? So let's kind of...
Can I disagree with
you?
Is it okay? Yeah. So as a deep zombie nerd, the episode of The Walking Dead, we're just going to bring some culture into this. The episode of The Walking Dead where they find the CDC bunker in Atlanta. Do you remember that? And they're talking with the infectious disease doctor, and he's losing his mind, and they're going through everything, and then he takes them to the lab and shows them this highly stylized brain imaging of a person who is dying and then has the whatever agent causes the zombies. You don't know yet. Spoiler alert. If you haven't seen this, it's a million years old. The whatever agent is causing the zombie takes over the nervous system on the imaging of that patient, right? Remember? Do you remember that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and you see, her brain, as she dies, lights up with all these colors, and then the colors stop, and then it lights up with a dark, quote-unquote, energy or something that causes an image on that imaging software. I'm assuming that they were going for a CT or a functional MRI as their source of that imaging. So where I'm going with this is it doesn't necessarily directly correlate with what you had said. It could be a life energy, right?
So low energy needs are a key component of this. And I think that's why they're living for long periods of time in a sort of torpor, where in that Last of Us episode, did you see that, where they were in the snowy mountains, and as soon as they hear humans come along, they burst out of the ice and snow, right?
Good
you saw
episode.
That, right?
Yeah, that was really good. I like that one a lot.
And so that gives us evidence of some kind that they can go for extended periods of time without food and water. And I think it's because you have a lot less energetic needs when so much of the brain is shut down. And that's what uses most of your energy and your calories and your fuel source. So that brings us into sensory triggers and sound. So they have a brain stem. It's a primitive part of the brain. It's spared in the zombie. And so it controls very basic reflexes, may or may not have some sort of heartbeat and respiration and things like that. That's why their movements may be jerky or slow or something like that. But when they hear a noise, they assume there's a human around, and then they start looking for a fuel source. And they have a few other components here, and that brings us to a drive for transmission. The Cordyceps in ant species, for example. So every episode we talk about a different organism. So if we're talking about Cordyceps, they control the brain, the mind, the neural network, or the nervous system of an ant or an insect. They have control over that. And the reason is because they want to transmit their spores and reproduce to something else. So they put the ant up on a stalk of grass, and it can rain down the spores on the rest of the ant colony. They know where the rest of the colony is going to be because they have a drive to spread and reproduce, just like basically any other organism on the planet. So chasing humans ensures that there's a bite or contact, spread the infection. The bite isn't necessarily for food, it's a vector. It's a way for the organism to go from one person to another one. So you don't necessarily want to kill all of your potential host, but this is how it spreads. This is the key to transmission. It kind of becomes like a delivery system. So the bite is one of those. Are truffles one of the mushroom species that can't be grown in industrial settings?
They've really, really had a hard time. Like so the European truffle species, nobody's been really successful commercially cultivating those. Here in Oregon, they, over the past 10 or 15 years, have been working on cultivating Oregon truffles with hazelnut orchards. And they're starting to become successful. But the hard part is the time that it takes to colonize that mycelium with that particular tree. And they run on such a different time scale than us humans do. I mean, you might put those cultivants in the ground and you may never ever see the truffles, but in like 50 years or 100 years, then those truffles start to produce fruiting bodies and are commercially viable. But they've proven that they can seed hazelnut orchards with a particular species of truffle and have that as a sustainable way to harvest those for culinary purposes. So yes, but it's hard. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty cool, actually. No wonder why those things are so expensive.
Well, and then the cool thing is you can train your truffle dogs in the hazelnut orchards where you know there's truffles and you know that they can get their reward. And then when you take them out into the wild, they have a higher chance of being successful and they enjoy it more because they know that they're going to find what they want to find. So I was at a barbecue. And we decided to eat mushrooms. And it was the first time I've ever eaten mushrooms. And it was at a friend's house in high school. And my boyfriend at the time bought the mushrooms.
Okay, so we had a whole extended rant here that was extremely entertaining, but also maybe a little too intense, weird, or wildly off topic for our main feed. So we've cut it from this version of the episode to keep things a little bit more listener-friendly. However, if you'd like to hear the full uncut version, with all of the gory details, science tangents, and our usual chaotic commentary, you can find it on our Patreon. Just head to patreon.com/Mutant Hollow to unlock the extended episode and support the show. Trust us, it's a ride.
I mean, I guess that's what you're saying. I guess that's the moral of the story is do more mushrooms. Either we're gonna wipe us out from a zombie apocalypse, which is cool, or we're all gonna reach a higher state of humanity and stop doing all the fucked up shit that we do, which is also cool. There's no downside.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Eat the mushrooms, yo. Are we too far off topic, Amber, about funguses? Because I really, really like mushrooms.
That was definitely not off topic, and it was perfectly on topic, and it was very interesting. Drop the mushroom knowledge.
Mushroom bomb.
Drop the mushroom knowledge on us.
Bomb. Oyster mushrooms are saprophytic, so just for what it's worth, they're eating that dead tissue to make their reproductive organs.
I want to know the mushrooms that you were talking about where they were cultivating something and then like introducing cordyceps across multiple species of mushrooms around, because I just felt there's some sort of crazy genetic thing that can happen that could turn us into a zombie. So tell us about sharing genes and what they're doing in the lab.
It's pretty actually amazing. You can just jump online. This is some shit. You can just jump online and you can order cordyceps tissue cultures.
What?
And then you can inoculate. Yeah, I'm not lying. So you can order zombie mushroom tissue cultures.
This seems
dangerous. You something right now. I could order it and have it shipped to your place of residence now. And
don't
it's not
ship it
terribly
to me.
expensive.
If there's a zombie apocalypse, I don't want to be responsible for it.
Well, and the crazy shit is the cordyceps, some of the cordyceps species are highly prized as medicinal or nutritional supplements for humans. The origin of that, we think, is in traditional Chinese medicine. And the particular species of cordyceps that they're using in Chinese medicine, the one that they're trying to get, I can't pronounce, but it's O. lateralis is the short version of the name, is one of them. And it is a species of cordyceps that affects a particular type of caterpillar in this one small area in Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau. And so you used to have to hand gather a certain time of the year the cordyceps that happen to affect a certain type of caterpillar. Now that ecosystem is extremely fragile, and the caterpillars, the moths, all of the insects in that area are under big habitat pressure and also pressure because humans are always collecting their corpses to get the mushrooms off of them. And that means that that cordyceps is also under a lot of human habitat pressure. So what humans do is we try to help in ways that might cause unintended consequences. And so they collected these tissue cultures from all of these cordyceps, and then they figured out how to grow those in agricultural environment rather than only harvesting them from the wild. And then there's also labs that are trying to use the cordyceps tissue cultures and wild cordyceps to study what compounds are in those mushrooms that are providing the benefit to humans. Namely, the reported benefits of cordyceps for humans are general invigorating of the body systems, lung function support, kidney function support, immunosupport, and then most recently, at least in medical science, they've been used for however long we have a written history for cancer support. But now we know that some of the compounds produced by these cordyceps mushrooms, or at least they're the fruiting bodies, the reproductive organs of the mycelium that is cordyceps, are useful for cancer treatment. And we're trying to learn how, and we're trying to synthesize those particular compounds, whether they're enzymes or proteins, so that we can target cancer treatment with this particular organism. That sounds great, right? We grow a mushroom, we eat it. It's good for us, right? Right?
Well, great. That's a great point. Okay, so if they have an association with helping or healing cancer, then it seems this is going to be something that's going to be coming into the lab more and more for testing and for modification of some kind. And this is the perfect setup, right? If we're setting up dominoes towards a zombie apocalypse, this is where it starts. And so what are some ways that one mushroom species can work with another one or transfer information? So they're working with some right now that can have healing benefits, but what if that's exposed to something that may have some damaging benefits? Like, aren't there ones that infect insects and modify the brain or the neural network of the insect and then kind of turn those into little zombies themselves? Because I feel like if nature is making an organism that is turning an insect into a zombie, it can turn a person into a zombie. So can you tell a story about an insect that might get infected with cordyceps?
Yeah. So let's set the stage for just a general overview of a particular type of cordyceps that can the mycelium infect a insect organism by spores landing on the insect, using enzymes to move their way into the body cavities of the insect. And then the mycelium hijacks their nervous system and their musculoskeletal, their muscle system, their movement system. So the mycelium hijacks nervous system movement, and then it forces a behavior change in that insect. We're speaking about an ant. So it forces a behavior change in that ant, and that ant, instead of following the rest of the ants on their little ant highways using pheromones to guide themselves, that ant decides, or the mycelium forces it to decide, that it's going to climb up the highest thing that it can find. And it's going to climb up a thing that's near its ant hive, its ant hill, its ant highways. So it's near other members of its species and its housemates, right? Its housemates. It climbs up as high as it can onto a leaf or a stick, and it clamps its jaws onto that leaf or the stick, and then it sticks the rest of its body out into the air. So it's face first on a stick and it's ass first out in the air. And then the mycelium decides that this is a great place, and we don't know how it figures this out. And then it starts to produce the fruiting body, the mushroom. And that's the part of the cordyceps that you notice in the humans in The Last of Us that are infected. In the zombie humans, all of those growths all over the humans are the reproductive organs of the cordyceps mushroom. They're mushrooms. They're fruiting bodies. So in this sad little ant, who technically is no longer alive, he's sticking out, a mushroom pops out of their body, and a gust of wind comes along. And the humidity is right, the temperature is right, the wind is right for that mushroom to sense that it's time to release its reproductive organs. So it spits spores everywhere, over where that highway is, right? And all those spores land on the rest of the ants that are just going about their life. And the cycle starts all over again. And that anthill is infected with zombie-making cordyceps mushrooms.
Wow. So what totally blows my mind is like, how does mycelium or a mushroom spore, how does it know where it is, where it wants the ant to go? Like if there's the other ant colony or the highway below it, so it can drain down its spores down on the ants below. It just blows my mind that it has this information, that it's smart enough to do this, that it knows how to control the ant and where it should go. But what sensory organs does a mycelium spore have? Or, by the time it's ready to do a fruiting body, what kind of consciousness does this thing have? There's something that we don't understand here, right?
Yeah, we don't understand how it hijacks the system. We know it does, but we don't know if it's using the nerves themselves in that ant to hijack the muscles. We don't know if the mycelium is just taking over the whole inside of the ant and it's moving itself through the mycelial networks with nothing to do with the ant's physiology or anatomy. We don't know how they talk to each other. We don't really understand how they sense their environment. Like, there are labs that have run slime molds through mazes based upon noxious stimuli. So the slime mold realizes that something gross and that might hurt it is near it, and so it changes its path of growth around that noxious stimuli. Or it knows that there's something really yummy in the corner of a maze, and it figures out how to work its way through the maze. This is without eyes, without ears, without a nose, without a brain that we understand as a brain. Some fascinating stuff. And then that leads to the question of, is there any consciousness left if you are a zombie? And we don't know the answer to that too. Fascinating. Then you have a whole philosophical debate, which we probably don't have time to get into, but sometime if somebody wants to talk about it, I'm into it.
I'm into it too. And there's a whole other separate section about like bacterial quorum sensing and things like that, where they have some sort of consciousness and we have no idea how that happens. So that is pretty fascinating. So here is where I'm going with this. We have a cordyceps fungus. They're working with it in the laboratory because it has all these benefits, but it can also take over a body or a nervous system in ways that we don't understand. It has consciousness or awareness, or it achieves goals in some way. We don't know how it does it. And people are working in a laboratory, and maybe different mycelium species or fungal species are communicating with each other. How do they transfer information? How do different fungus species transfer information or genetic material to each other?
Yeah. Well, I guess if we're thinking from a global zombie apocalypse that's fungi-based, I could think of several ways that it could go from what we know now to something that could affect a human the way that certain species affect their quote-unquote host insects. I could think of like gene transfer is one of the ways that we could hypothesize the jump from an insect to a mammal for fungal takeover. Gene transfer is something that we are just learning to understand, and it happens a lot in bacteria. When a bacteria or a one-celled organism eats another one-celled organism, they can steal some of that genetic material and incorporate it into their own systems. Mitochondria is one of the things that does this. Mitochondria are in bacterial cells, and they provide energy, and they are all over in mammals, in our guts, on our skin, in our airways. They're everywhere. So there's an argument that if one fungal cell that happened to have a mutation that allowed it to attack a mammal, and we'll talk about what that would need to happen, then that gene could be expressed in the rest of the mycelium, and they could technically, quote-unquote, mutate to be more adaptable to mammals rather than just insects. So gene transfer. We could also see accidental oopsies in the lab, right? If we are culturing these tissues for medicinal purposes, if we are culturing these cell lines to try to synthesize enzymes or proteins that are useful for humans, there's always a chance that we could, accidentally switch a gene on, switch a gene off, put in a particular enzyme that makes the whole system go haywire to make those fungal cells be able to cross into mammals.
Right, exactly. And this is how accidental laboratory releases always happen or start out with. They're working with some sort of modification. They're making a mutation. They have consequences though. So maybe they're adding something. If it's for medicine or cancer, maybe they're adapting it more for humans just so it works better in human cancer cells. Maybe they're trying to target, my goodness, listen to this. What if they were trying to target brain cancer and they wanted to add a mutation to cross the blood-brain barrier? How would this affect in a scenario like The Last of Us, the Cordyceps, fungus, zombies? How would a mutation adapted for crossing the blood-brain barrier affect Cordyceps if it became a lab release accidentally and started doing gene transfer with other types of fungal organisms or mycelial networks? Wouldn't this create like the perfect storm for an outbreak or an apocalypse of some kind, or a release? Like, what would that look like?
Shit. You know, we're going to go off script here because you just gave me the best scenario ever. Can I just tell you about it?
Yes, please.
I know we're supposed to be staying on track, but okay, so yeah. So let's take the cancer angle, but let's flip it, quote unquote, on its head and think about lung cancer. And let's think about Cordyceps producing a particular compound that can target lung cancer cells. And the docs in the lab are trying to save humanity. They're really working hard to do good. And they figure out a way that they can trigger the Cordyceps to overproduce an enzyme that can kill lung cancer cells. And then they make it as an inhaled medication because injectable chemo is really hard on the body. Radiation is terribly hard on the body. But if you could just take a nebulizer hit of Cordyceps that automatically targets your lung cancer, delivered exactly where it needs to go. But fuck, we made it so that it can also grow its mycelium, and that human body can take over and do what it's made to do. Grow fruiting bodies, produce spores, alter behavior to seek other hosts that can grow fruiting bodies and produce spores.
I love this. And didn't you say that they are already working on Cordyceps and other fungal species to work for agricultural use and things like that? They're already doing this, right? In some ways. And maybe they're not thinking about gene transfer or spontaneous mutations that could happen along the lines of things that they weren't intending or thinking about. So what are some agricultural uses? Because they are doing things like this.
Yeah, unintended consequences are a bitch, right? And humans are fantastic at producing unintended consequences. So I could also hypothesize, if we take the medical aspect out of it, we know that Cordyceps attacks certain insect species that are perhaps important in agriculture, right? So we know that it attacks caterpillars, we know ants, locusts, grasshoppers, that sort of thing. And caterpillars and locusts and grasshoppers all have an impact on agriculture, especially like grain support. And we know that pesticides and herbicides are damaging ecosystems in ways that we either didn't used to care about, but now we do, or are unintended. So as those pesticides and herbicides, the chemical versions of those, are becoming banned or frowned upon or expensive to produce, our ag science system is trying to find alternatives that are less impactful on the environment, that are targeted to the pests that you actually want to kill, not just every bug in the neighborhood. And that don't harm the humans that are directly in contact or in the general vicinity. So using Cordyceps fungus for targeted pest control in an agricultural setting, if you're breeding the Cordyceps to affect the pest that you are trying to get, and since Cordyceps is very host specific, one species of Cordyceps affects one or a couple of types of insects, you can target it more directly than with a pesticide. Does that make sense?
Yes, this is fantastic because it sounds like laboratory mutations are becoming more and more of a possibility over time. And there are chemicals that we can't use anymore that we know are cancer causing, and we may find in the future that more and more of these chemicals are damaging, so they may find natural alternatives to these types of things. And mycelium and fungus would be the perfect thing. If they can infect an insect, then that would be a perfect, natural cure. And the more that we work with these, the more chance we get for mutations and things like that. I think that poses a risk. But things like this are happening in the bacterial and virology world, like with bacteriophages. So there are natural alternatives to a lot of different things, but these are living organisms that grow and change on their own. They do gene transfer, and they have behaviors or changes or mutations that are sometimes unexpected. So again, we're going back to, we don't exactly know what we're doing or what's going to happen when we go to the laboratory and create something that maybe we're targeting something in particular. Say we want to target grasshoppers in a wheat field, but then what if that mutation also adapts the fungus for something that could alter us or humanity? Or what are some of the mutations that would need to take place in order for a cordyceps or another fungal infection to infect a human and modify behavior? Because there's a few challenges, right, that it would have to overcome. We're not as simple as an invertebrate species. So what are the differences between invertebrates and humans, and what other additional mutations would have to take place?
You said it. It's challenging, right? Because mammals in general are complicated. We already have some biological and medical precedents for fungal species causing disease in humans and in other animals. The big one is valley fever, or coccidiomycosis. That's a southern United States fungal infection that is contracted by inhaling spores from the environment, and it affects the brain. It affects the lungs and the GI tract, so there's lots of room to speculate that it could lead to humans being a vector for the spores. When we're thinking about how a fungus can cause disease in a mammal or take over a human and lead to zombification, we think that there's some hurdles like temperature that have to be overcome. Most fungal species do not do well at high temperatures, and our higher general body temperature is one of the biggest defense mechanisms that our bodies have to fungal disease. There's some that are okay in human bodies and that can do their thing, like yeast organisms, but in general, we haven't died off as a species from fungal disease because our body temperature. The hard part about that is our world is warming up, and climate change is leading to increased general Earth temperature, and that is a environmental pressure on all of the species on Earth to adapt to that high temperature, including funguses. So there might be an environmental push to overcome the temperature barrier for funguses to affect mammals. And the other thing is crossing that blood-brain barrier that you mentioned. It's very, very tight immune control over what can be in the rest of the body and then what can be in our nervous systems, our brain, our spinal cord, and our nerves. And our immune system is so good at controlling the cross-contamination from the rest of the body into the brain that it makes it really hard for organisms to jump that. So a spore that would land on the skin on a human may be able to burrow into the skin, may be able to affect mucous membranes like the lining of the lungs and the GI tract, but it can't force itself across that blood-brain barrier. All we would need for that to happen is 1 or 2 proteins not being expressed on the surface of a fungal cell so that our immune system would no longer recognize it as a threat and then be able to transport themselves across that blood-brain barrier to take over the nervous system.
Wow. So, yeah, no, this is great. So here's my favorite thing about Cordyceps, right? When I'm thinking about the likelihood, is this organism one of the organisms that could be zombified? Is this one of the organisms that could create a zombie? You're talking about a couple of different hurdles here, and one of them being temperature adaptation. And so one of the things that protects us is it doesn't like our temperature. And right now, globally, everybody and everything is adapting to increases in temperature over time. Every year it gets a little bit hotter, and these plants, animals, insects, fungi, microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, all of these things are either dying off from the heat or they're adapting. They're living at temperatures that are higher and higher, and they're adapting to be able to survive. Some of them will die off, and the ones that live are the ones that reproduce, and you have gene transfer to the next generation of organisms, and that generation is going to be more adapted to a higher temperature. And so naturally, this is happening without us even helping it out. So naturally, this organism is in real time adapting to higher temperatures. So the next big hurdle is crossing the blood-brain barrier. And so I think in the show The Last of Us, for example, this has to be what happened. So with any organism, some organisms mutate faster than others. So you can get a vaccine for one organism. It could last you your whole entire life. It will give you protection. A lot of people had like the MMR vaccine, like measles, mumps, and rubella when they were children. And most of these people, if you are vaccinated, you never get infected. It will last you for your entire life because those organisms don't mutate as rapidly. So that protection that you got from the vaccine, the antibodies that you received, they still apply because the organism is still the same, so your body still recognizes it 50, 60, 70 years later. However, when you get a flu vaccine, the reason why you have to get one every season is because flu is fantastic at mutating. It's rapidly mutating all of the time. If, let's say, Cordyceps or another fungal species acquires the adaptation to cross the blood-brain barrier, that's one thing. However, what if it just learns to mutate faster? So what if there's one fungal species that mutates faster than the other? It does gene transfer to a Cordyceps that can like zombify your brain. How many different fungal species or Cordyceps species are out there? And how many of them could possibly have a mutation that, Cordyceps could use to infect humans and affect the brain? Now that we've explored the science behind infection, let's dig a little bit deeper into the dirt, the myths, and the memories that shaped the zombie before the science ever gave it a name. Welcome to our culture, folklore, and history segment, where each week we travel across time and borders to uncover how different societies imagine the undead, the cursed, and the corrupted. Because sometimes the most terrifying microbes are the ones we can't see, but we've always feared. This week we're heading to Haiti, where the story of Haitian zombies reveals how ancient fears mirror modern infection and how cryptomicrobiology might just be the next chapter in an age-old myth. But don't get too comfortable, because after we crawl through folklore, we'll be back with Stacy's mind-blowing theory on why zombies really eat brains. And trust me, it's not just for shock value. Let's pause the spores, mutations, and all too real fungal freakouts for a moment and step into something older, something buried. It's time for a mid-episode folklore and history segment, the Folklore Files. Every week here in Mutant Hollow, we dust off one story, one myth, one legend, or one cultural moment that shaped the zombie archetype long before science ever gave it a name. These stories often come from times when a body that wasn't quite dead, or a behavior that couldn't be explained, was chalked up to the supernatural. Sometimes the scariest things aren't viruses or fungi, but the fear itself. The fear of being burned alive, the fear of losing your will, the fear of never being seen as fully human ever again. This week's story takes us to the heart of Haiti, where the myth of the zombie wasn't born from fiction, but from a mix of ritual, pharmacology, and colonial trauma. Stacy, can you explain how the Haitian zombie is different from the pop culture zombie that we usually think of?
Yeah, so the Haitian zombie in general is actually someone that has been attacked by another human or a victim of an attack. And typically the attacker is a voodoo priest or priestess who makes a concoction. We don't know exactly what's in it, but hypothetically being multiple toxins and certain plants that will affect motor function in the body, will affect mentation or your consciousness level, and affect behavior. So the theory is that it's a puffer fish toxin called tetrodotoxin, a particular plant called datura root, which has hallucinogenic effects, and then a combination of other things. The person who ingests or is administered that combination of toxins no longer has free will over themselves, can appear dead for a period of time.
In 1985, anthropologist and ethnobotanist Wade Davis published a controversial book called The Serpent and the Rainbow. It explored the idea that zombification wasn't magic, it was medicine, or more specifically, poisoning. I have also heard that datura root is also called the zombie cucumber, because some of the effects, if you're exposed to it, can cause hallucinations, memory loss, and psychosis. In the book, Davis follows the story of a man that was declared dead only to show up alive 18 years later, and he claimed to have been enslaved on a plantation. And so it sounds like this story could have been embellished, or who knows if it's actually true. I think that you've mentioned that there's some controversy behind it. Can you kind of talk about the process that this would take and how it kind of looks like a zombie? Because it sounds like there are many history or historical stories or tales through time where somebody was thought to be dead, buried, came back to life, or they thought they came back to life. It turns out that they just weren't dead after all. So how did the toxin make the person appear to be dead, and how come they had an after effect after they were quote unquote resurrected, where they didn't quite act normally or the same after that?
Yeah, it brings up a very interesting philosophical question about what actually is dead. For much of history, it's been difficult for us to prove death until someone hasn't moved or had obvious breathing for a period of time or has already started to rot, which sounds really crazy, right? Like that you may not have known if your loved one was dead. But there's been a whole culture of protecting the living from the quote-unquote undead throughout human history. One of the things that we used to do as humans was put cages around a grave so that the person wouldn't rise from the dead or be undead, just in case we didn't get it right when we thought that they were dead and we buried them. There was also a culture, I think it was in the late 1700s. We'll have to research this and make sure that I'm not going crazy. But there was a period of time where people would put mirrors or put tubes down into graves so that the person that had been buried could breathe still in case they were still alive, or could ring a bell to alert everyone that they had inadvertently been buried alive when they woke up. A lot of it was related to consumption or tuberculosis outbreaks, and whether or not someone was actually dead from tuberculosis or if they were still alive. So bringing it back to the Haitian zombies, the datura root root and the tetrodotoxin might in combination slow body functions enough that in an untrained medical situation, it might be thought that the human had died. If the heart rate is extremely low, if their blood pressure is quite low, if their respirations are very shallow and infrequent, but there's still enough brain activity to maintain life, it might look to an untrained observer or someone that doesn't have the tools to screen for life versus death that a human had actually died, and they might have been interred in a grave or put in an area for viewing, and then the toxin eventually wears off, and 3 to 5 days later, that human is now alive, but the deter root is an intense hallucinogenic, and they may have been oxygen deprived for a period of time, so their memory and their cognitive function might be poor, and they might be easily influenced or directed by another human to do tasks or process behaviors.
So they kind of became enslaved because the brain damage made them kind of like automatons, which kind of ties back to Cordyceps behavioral modification, where it kills parts of your brain, keeps just enough to keep you alive and to maybe take commands as far as the deter root goes. And that way you can be used and manipulated. So maybe this was potentially a poison or whatever the reason, but poison caused sorcerer or Haitian voodoo bokor caused or not, this is a real life zombie situation that occurred at some point in history, and there are instances like this throughout time that have kept the zombie folklore, mysticism, and cryptid fascination alive. So I think this is one of many great stories in folklore, culture, and history that I find very interesting, whether it's plausible or not that this is an actual poison or if some of this was fabricated or embellished. I think this is an interesting story because, just like you said, where graves were installed with bells or other mechanisms, and it could be just because your heart rate is so low and your breathing is so faint that you appear dead, but you're not. And scientifically, people were at a disadvantage in the past before advances of science and medical technology came along to verify livelihood or the status of your deadness, aliveness, whatever you call it.
I mean, even today, sometimes it's hard to tell if someone's dead or not, even with all of the tools that we have with ECG, because you can have leftover electrical signals for a period of time that still look like a heartbeat, but the heart's not actually beating, and EEG that can measure brain waves for a period of time. We don't actually know what the point of death truly is and what that exactly looks like from a brain physiology standpoint. We're still learning.
Interesting. Technically, I guess it could still happen to this day. In Haitian culture, zombification wasn't just feared, it was a warning, a cultural metaphor, an ultimate loss of autonomy, and a way to make sense of slavery, colonization, and trauma that couldn't be spoken aloud. Stacy, would you say that myths like this often emerge from real historical trauma or attempts to make sense of something unexplainable?
Yeah, 100%. Humans, as a coping mechanism, use story to manage tragedy. We can trace that back through all of our oral traditions, even Grimm's fairy tales. Everybody knows about those. Those were stories to manage tragedy and to guide cultural behaviors and to situations that could cause damage to the society or the culture or the family. Yeah. Cautionary tales.
Cautionary tales. The story of the Haitian zombie isn't just about death. It's about control, silence, servitude. The body's reduced to a tool. And that's what makes it one of the most haunting precursors to today's zombie lore. Because sometimes real horror isn't the grave, it's what happens after. That was Unearthed. Stay tuned as we head back into the infection zone to talk about what fungi, viruses, and rogue proteins are cooking up in today's apocalypse. Welcome back, survivors. We hope you enjoyed that detour into myth and mystery, because now it's time to dive back into the meat of the infection. This is segment 3, and it's the part I've been waiting for all episode. We're picking right up where we left off in our scientific deep dive, but this time we're going even further into the strange, speculative edges of microbiology and mutation. This is where Stacy shines because she's got theories. big ones, the kind that make you stare at your houseplants a little bit longer and wonder. We're talking mutation, manipulation, and the horrifying what if of Cordyceps adapting to humans. And to kick it off, let's talk about the classic question that everyone loves to ask, but science never really answers. Stacy, what's your theory on why zombies eat brains? And if we imagine an evolved pathogen capable of altering human behavior, what's the evolutionary advantage of brain eating? Is it about transmission, instinct, or something even stranger? And this next theory from Stacy, it might be my favorite yet. Zombie lore across books, games, and movies, zombies almost always eat brains. But in your theoretical model, that's not about transmission, right? So what's the purpose of brain eating? I have a question for you, Stacy, and and it's the killing, right? So if you encounter a zombie, you can assume that your life is in danger. And when you're thinking about a behavioral modification from an organism that wants you to bite another person or encounter another person in order to transmit that organism and infect somebody else so it could reproduce, it ends up killing, in pop culture, zombies, a lot of people because it eats your brain or your guts, rips you apart and stuff like that. So my question to you is, what is the evolutionary advantage of eating brains or intestines when this is going to kill the potential host? There has to be some sort of physiological answer that the Cordyceps isn't inputting or isn't creating that behavioral trait in the zombie or infected host. What could possibly be the reason why it's doing something that could be so damaging to the host? There has to be some sort of impetus or reason or rationale or instinctual or evolutionary reason for eating brains and organ tissue. Do you have any idea of what that could be?
Yeah, I think that is a fascinating hypothetical train of thought. So if we're taking Zombie 101, Physiology 101 in general, the bite to infectivity argument, we can use that for a lot of other species. But for fungus, especially Cordyceps, we take that off the table, right? A bite for infectivity isn't relevant for what we know about Cordyceps species. The relevancy for transmission specifically is spore transmission. So using the host body to support the reproductive fruiting bodies of that particular Cordyceps so that they can produce spores through that reproductive fruiting body. So we can take out the bite for infectivity off the table. And spoiler alert, the exposure to spores of Cordyceps in The Last of Us leads to zombification. You don't have to be attacked by a human that is actively infected with the spores, right? If you come in contact with the spores, then you become a zombie. So that makes it easy for this particular organism to not worry about an evolutionary pressure for biting for transmission. Does that make sense? There's more of an evolutionary pressure to be near or around other organisms that are the same as you, so that when those spores are released, they infect those other organisms that are like you, like a human or an ant.
So biting is not necessarily, or the eating is not for transmission?
Not for this particular type of zombie. But you're still being attacked and you're still being killed, right? They're
right.
Still attacking and killing and apparently eating other living organisms. So here's my theory. You ready?
Yes, what's your theory? I need to hear it.
Okay. So the two parts of the central nervous system that a zombie in general would require to use their body. A cerebellum, so the back part of the brain that coordinates movement. And it doesn't have to do it smoothly or well. You just need to shamble around, or depending on your genre, run towards a stimulus. The cerebellum controls that motor function. So we have to leave the back of the brain intact. And we have to leave the sensory organs in some capacity intact. Whether or not we have a heartbeat, whether or not we have any respirations, whether we're technically dead or just terribly infected but still sort of alive, we need the sensory organs to be at least partially functioning. So you need a brainstem. You need where sensory organs bring their feedback. But you don't necessarily need a full front of the brain. You don't necessarily need a full and intact cerebellum. And the cerebellum is deeply separated from the brainstem and from the cerebral structures. So you could, in theory, attack a human, eat the front part of the brain, which isn't of relevance anymore because a zombie doesn't need to talk. A zombie doesn't need to have emotional relationships with other humans in its life. A zombie doesn't need to do calculus or drive a car, right? So we can get rid of the front part of the brain without necessarily damaging the parts of the human body that a zombie would need to go about its function as a zombie. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what does it need? What is it doing? Like, why?
Right.
What is the reason?
Why? So what if, hypothetically speaking, that mutated Cordyceps fungus cannot make a particular enzyme or protein that we as humans do produce in that particular part of our brain? Let's pick something. Let's pick dopamine. What if that Cordyceps needs dopamine to make its spores, but it can't make the dopamine itself? It has to get it from its environment, whether saprophytically or whether it attacks and kills an organism to get that dopamine enzyme. So what if they can sense dopamine, because we know that they can navigate their environment, they can sense what's happening now. What if they can sense that dopamine and they use the host body not only to make reproductive organs and spores, but also to gather the material that they need to make those spores that they can't produce themselves. So they're drawn to the front part of the brain where there's already dopamine synthesized. They eat your brain, the host body, and all the mycelia that are taking over the host body absorb that dopamine, make their spores, grow a fruiting body, spit the spores out, and the cycle continues.
Wait a freaking minute. Okay, so this is brilliant. And we were just talking about how Cordyceps has some sort of situational or environmental awareness, and we don't know how, but it knows what it needs. It knows it has to reproduce. It needs certain things to live, and it's getting it by modifying the behavior of its host, aka a zombie, into eating brains to get its protein, enzyme, or whatever hormone or component that it needs to survive. And it's modifying the behavior in order to do so, which is what it does in real life right now. That's absolutely a brilliant theory. And what's crazy is this never gets explained. Nobody really knows why it happens, but this is a phenomenal organism to have started with, because it specifically modifies behavior. It knows what it's doing. It knows what it needs, and it knows what it needs to survive. And so here's another crazy theory. Okay. This is blowing my mind right now. Okay. So,
good shit.
Okay. So fungal species need oxygen just like we do. And so there are some materials if mammalian species got infected, that we would be competing with the organism for oxygen. And as we have oxygen deprivation in our own cells, because that oxygen that we're respirating is being used for sporulation, the fungus is fighting for resources and losing oxygen as or parts of our brain or body are dying or rotting. There's like a partial rotting process that's happening with zombie folklore because there's not as much food input and things like that. You don't need as much food, but the organism in this case also needs its own resources. So it's creating impetus for the own behavior in the host to find more resources by doing this, because there's only so much oxygenation that can happen, and the fungus needs it. And the fungus is using that and the dopamine enzymes, proteins, endocrinology, and other components in the brain. And as the body is rotting, it has an even more aggressive will to find more resources. Go ahead.
What you said is reasonable, right? So especially if we throw in one more complication, that the Cordyceps is a saprophytic fungus, and it's slowly digesting the body that it is the host while it's manipulating that body to search out resources and produce reproductive organs. So it's like we are the bag of straw that is slowly getting digested, and the Cordyceps is the oyster mushroom that is using that bag of straw to pop out fruiting bodies and spores. The oxygen versus like anaerobic versus aerobic metabolism is an interesting debate.
Well, they do need oxygen though, right? Are they adapted for anaerobic respiration?
So I would assume that they some species must be, because so many of them are saprophytic underneath the soil, and their infectivity can be in the brain. So when we're doing fungal cultures, we do aerobic, anaerobic, and fungal cultures from a medical standpoint, if we're looking for organisms that are causing disease. We do aerobic, anaerobic bacteria, and fungal as a separate culture, but you still have to be really careful with preparing those fungal culture samples.
That's excellent. So as the host body is rotting, the mycelium could adapt to a lower oxygen environment by switching to anaerobic respiration and find its ATP or energy in other ways. And so that is another excellent adaptation. And let me just can I give you a little glimpse of what this might look like? Mycelium infection. So a single spore lands in the lungs. It's the perfect environment. It's warm, moist, oxygen rich. And with every breath, carbon dioxide is being pulled away. Mycelium hate the carbon dioxide or anything above 600 parts per million, and so it starts to choke. But here it thrives. The spores take root. It begins to stretch thread by thread, forming networks and tendrils of fungal consciousness across the lungs. And then it spreads and flows through the blood vessels like roads, chasing the nutrients. And as oxygenated blood flows, so does the mycelium, invading every tissue, organ, and cell. At first, the host is alive, and then slowly it isn't. And so the parasitic takeover suffocates the brain, but not entirely. The mycelium, needing oxygen itself, preserves just enough function in the brainstem to keep the body barely alive. So it's becoming symbiotic. And I'm assuming also saprophytic as the body dies. And respiration continues, but it's just enough for the both of them. And maybe respiration can continue in a symbiotic way where maybe the host organism is also keeping the body alive by creating just enough oxygen to keep the brainstem of the host alive. So that's when things get a little bit darker. So the fungus has mined the body for all of the nutrients, and there's nothing left to give. So the host is weak, rotting, and starving, but it can't die, not fully, not while the fungus still needs to move. And so the body begins to crave. And it's not instinct, it's not hunger, but it's commanded by the mycelium, by the organism. And the mycelium drives the host towards dense nutrient tissue or nutrient-rich tissue, aka brains. And it's a forced feeding cycle. So not just to nourish the human, but to keep the fungus alive. And the mycelium is cannibalizing its own host while directing it to harvest more fuel. So, and that's why the flesh rots. That's why the limbs fall away, because no matter how much the body consumes, it's being devoured from the inside out. So there's a walking corpse animated by a parasite that needs oxygen and mobility, and it needs the brains, but not for thought, it's for survival. So that kind of sounds like what you're saying is the brain of another host body is twofold. The Cordyceps wants it to be attracted to another human for the bite for transmission. And if it gets a chance, that's where it gets its fuel source, the essential proteins or nutrients it needs, the enzymes. It somehow instinctively knows what it needs, and that's how it gets it. So I think that's a brilliant, beautiful, eloquent theory. And I hope that as we go into different organisms throughout the series, maybe we can find some adaptations that might make each one unique about each one. That was brilliant, Stacy.
Yeah, I think we can come up with theories, or at least semi-rational ways that we could talk ourselves into all of these becoming a zombie apocalypse. Because that's the whole point, right?
It is possible, though. You're talking about it like we're just making the stuff up. It's freaking possible, Stacy.
I hear you. Anything's possible. Life will find a way.
That was beautiful. I think you're fucking brilliant. Oh, God. Oh, my God. So we've walked through the science, we've dug through the folklore, and we've even danced through a few terrifying hypotheticals. But before we close the hatch on today's episode, we have one last question to answer. And this is my favorite question, and the one that we'll be asking in every episode. I know you've talked about it, you've touched on a little bit with the transmissibility and lethality, but my question to you, Stacy, on a scale from 1 to 10, will it zombie?
That's the ultimate question. And for Cordyceps fungus, I give it a 3 on the will it zombie scale. I know, I'm real sorry. So sorry.
So I know Cordyceps has some big biological hurdles to overcome, and I know you said it takes millions of years to mutate, but we never know. It has to cross the blood-brain barrier, adapt to human body heat, which is happening right now. It has to reproduce faster, it has to become more mutagenic, but it can already, and its strong points are, it can already hijack behavior, infect the nervous system, and in some rare cases, even target other fungi. You gave it a 3 out of 10, but I really feel I feel like it's a 6. I feel like it's at least a 6, but I feel all of the zombie organisms.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, anything is possible. And all of this is just a matter of time. But a 6? I think that's overly optimistic.
Okay.
Should we just land on a 4.5 together?
Listen, I am not changing my answer, and you can keep a 3 all day long. I would like to see what other people think. I think freak mutations happen all the time that we don't expect. Like, it happens every day in real life. So maybe people can go to one of our pages or one of our messengers or something. I don't know how technology works, but I want to hear everybody else's vote. What do you think? On a scale from 1 to 10, will it zombie? Because Stacy, the rational, logical, like, scientifically minded person.
Thank you.
That wasn't a compliment.
Oh.
You're giving it a 3, but we have all of the perfect conditions. All we need are a couple tiny little mutations. But like, this would be the perfect organism. And you saw it in The Last of Us. Like, they gave you the scenario, they show you what it looks, they show you how it mutates over time. They're alluding to some other mutations that I'm really excited about, but I just feel this is a beautiful organism, especially because of the behavioral control. So I want to hear what other people think.
It's a beautiful organism. That doesn't mean that it's going to cause a zombie apocalypse.
Okay, whatever, Stacy. Fair enough.
I want to hear what other people have to say about it too.
Same.
Just a warning, if you thought this one was wild, you haven't heard anything yet. We've got zombie prions, parasitic worms that mind control snails, and at least one pathogen Amber swears is a solid 9 on the zombie scale. Dude, you have to give us a hint.
No way. I totally swear, though, I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not being overly optimistic. It's totally a 9, but you're going to have to wait for another episode.
All right, we'll keep your secrets for now. Thanks for listening to this episode of Mutant Hollow, where science is stranger than fiction, and maybe a little closer to reality than we'd like to think. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and whatever you do, maybe skip that mushroom tea at your next apothecary visit.
Hell yeah. That's it for today's dive into the crypt and the lab. From Haitian graveyards to global pandemic sims, we've uncovered just a fraction of what makes zombies more than just horror. They're reflections of fear, control, and the unknown.
Whether they're rising from ritual, spores, or simulations, zombies help us explore what it means to lose ourselves and what it takes to survive. Thanks for joining us in the Hollow.
And remember, every week we'll be featuring a new piece of the undead puzzle, from ancient folklore to speculative science. So don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and
maybe don't accept mysterious powders from a sorcerer.
Catch us next time on Mutant Hollow, where we help you stay one step ahead of the outbreak or the afterlife. Coming up on the next episode of Mutant Hollow, it starts with a bite, a scratch, a moment too late, and suddenly the fear spreads, not just through the body, but through the entire civilizations. We're diving into the oldest undead virus known to humanity. Oh, a virus so ancient it may be the original spark behind zombie folklore, with symptoms that turn the infected into violent, foaming, light-fearing, water-hating creatures. It's no wonder the myths began.
Join us as we uncover how this real-world pathogen inspired centuries of undead stories, and why it still terrifies scientists today. Could a mutation make it airborne? Could it be the blueprint for a real zombie outbreak? Science, history, and a splash of horror, served with a side of quarantine protocol.
Don't miss this episode before it's too late to vaccinate.
Gnaw on that subscribe button like it's your last brain. Join the horde!
Horde!
Or the horde!
Sink your teeth into that subscribe button and stay one step ahead of the plague.
I think that should be the one.
Gnaw on that subscribe button like it's your last brain. Join the horde! Mutant Hollow. Don't worry, we're only mostly dead.